right at the start, so there is no confusion. This video is about a $3 trap you can build in under 10 minutes from parts at any hardware store, and it outperforms the $80 commercial model sitting next to it on the same game trail. I know that sounds impossible. I thought the same thing. But the trail camera footage we captured over 72 hours does not lie. And by the time you finish watching this, you are going to understand exactly why it works and why nobody in the trapping industry is ever going to tell you about it. Stay with me to the end, because there is a detail in the assembly that most people skip, and without it, the whole thing falls apart. It started on a Tuesday morning in late October when I pulled off a county road in rural Pennsylvania to visit a man named Earl Gifford. Earl is 86 years old. He has been trapping fur-bearing animals since 1963, which means he was running trap lines before most of the companies selling you equipment today even existed. His hands look like something carved out of hickory wood. His truck has over 300,000 miles on it. His trap shed smells like rust and lard and old leather, and it is the most useful room I have ever walked into in my life. I had heard about Earl from a guy at a fur auction in Chambersburg. He said Earl was the kind of trapper who came home with a full haul on mornings when everyone else was checking empty sets. He said Earl's methods were different, old, stubborn in a way that actually works. I drove 3 hours to find out if that was true. When I got there, Earl was already outside. He had a commercial trap in one hand, one of those brand-name coil spring models that runs about $80 retail, and he was shaking his head at it the way you shake your head at a car repair bill. He set it down on a wooden workbench and said, quote 0. I told him I could guess. He said, quote 1. Then he reached into a coffee can on the shelf and pulled out something that looked almost too simple to be real. A flat metal mounting bracket, the kind used in basic carpentry, a short length of galvanized wire, and a tension spring pulled from a standard household screen door. He held all three up together and said, underscore, quote, underscore 2, underscore, total cost of those three components at any hardware store in America. Under $3. I checked. $1.19 for the bracket, 60 cents for the wire, 89 cents for the spring. You can buy everything in one trip without asking anyone for help. I am going to tell you exactly how Earl builds it, step by step, the way he showed me on camera that morning. You start with the flat metal bracket. The specific one Earl uses is a standard mending plate, sometimes called a flat corner brace, roughly 3 inches by 1.5 inches, with pre-drilled holes along both sides. You can find it in the fasteners aisle at any hardware store, Home Depot, Ace, Tractor Supply, they all carry it. Cost is around $1. You take that bracket and bend it slightly at the center, just enough to create a shallow angle, maybe 20 to 25 degrees. Earl does this by hand over the edge of a workbench, no tools required. That bend is the first critical detail. Too sharp and the mechanism binds. Too flat and it loses sensitivity. You want the kind of angle where if you set a pencil across the middle of the bracket, it would roll off slowly, not sit still and not shoot off instantly. Earl described it as a lazy lean, and that is exactly right. Next, you take your tension spring and attach it to one end of the bracket, using a short loop of galvanized wire threaded through the end hole of the bracket. The wire loop goes through the first pre-drilled hole, through the eye of the spring, and twists back on itself 3 times to lock. No soldering. No hardware beyond what you already have. The spring should sit along the underside of the bracket and pull toward the center when compressed. When you press the opposite end of the bracket down, the spring loads. When you release it, the spring snaps the bracket back to its open angle. That snap is your trigger action. That is the entire mechanical system. The trigger itself is a small notch filed into the top surface of the bracket at the center bend point. Earl uses a standard metal file, about 4 passes, to create a shallow groove just wide enough to catch the tip of your bait wire. The bait wire, your last component, is a 6-inch length of galvanized wire bent into an L shape at one end. You hook the short end of the L into that notch, with your bait attached to the long end. The animal reaches for the bait, disturbs the wire, the notch releases, the spring fires, and the bracket closes. 3 parts, 1 moving assembly. Nothing to jam, nothing to freeze, nothing to corrode into failure. Earl set one up from scratch in front of me in 8 minutes, including the time he spent explaining each step out loud. Then he handed me the parts for a second one and watched me build it. I had it done in 11 minutes. He said that was better than most people he had taught, which I appreciated, even if I suspect he says that to everyone. Now here is the question I want to ask you before we go any further, because I genuinely want to know. Have you ever built any kind of homemade hunting or trapping gear from scratch? Write yes or no in the comments right now. It takes 2 seconds, and I read every single one. We carried both traps out to a game trail Earl had been watching for 3 seasons. It runs along the edge of a harvested cornfield where the soil stays soft from drainage and the brush piles up thick on the eastern side. Muskrat and mink both use it regularly. Earl knew the trail the way most people know their morning commute. He could point to 3 different spots along a 40-foot stretch and tell you which animal had been there, how recently, and which direction it was heading. We set the homemade trap at the primary crossing point, pressed into the soft soil so the top surface sat flush with the ground. Earl was precise about depth. He said the bracket surface needs to be level with the surrounding dirt to within about 1/8 of an inch. Higher than that, and the animal steps around it. Lower, and the mechanism has to fight the soil to close, and it slows the strike. He used a flat piece of bark to tamp the edges down, and scattered a small amount of loose soil over the bracket surface using his bare hand. Light coverage. Just enough to break up the outline without filling the notch. The commercial trap went in about 4 feet away, at a secondary crossing point Earl said was equally trafficked. We followed the manufacturer's setup instructions to the letter. Pan tension, chain stake, jaw spread, everything exactly as recommended on the box. Both traps baited identically with a small amount of mink lure Earl makes himself from gland secretions he collects during the season. Same location, same bait, same weather exposure. Then we walked away and let the trail camera run for 72 hours. If you are not subscribed to this channel yet, do it right now and hit the bell, because this is exactly the kind of content we put out every week. Real field tests, real methods, real results. No sponsored products, no paid endorsements. If it works, we show it. If it does not, we show that too. Hit the like button while you are at it, because it helps more people find this. The footage from those 72 hours told a story that was hard to argue with. The homemade trap triggered 4 times over 3 days. 4 clean catches, 0 misfires. The mechanism closed on contact every single time with no hesitation, including once at 4 in the morning when the temperature had dropped to 28 degrees and there was light frost on the ground. Cold weather is where simple mechanisms survive and complex ones die, and that footage proved it better than any explanation could. The commercial trap triggered 3 times. 2 successful catches, 1 misfire. On the misfire, you can see in the footage that the animal contacted the pan. The jaws began to close and then stopped halfway. Earl watched that clip twice without saying a word. Then he said, "That is the 7th moving part." The jaw on that side had resistance from a small amount of compressed soil that had gotten under the spring housing during the night. Not a defect, not user error. Just what happens to a mechanism with more parts than it needs when the environment pushes back. Over 72 hours on equivalent traffic with equivalent bait. 4 catches for the $3 trap, 2 catches for the $80 trap. Earl was not surprised. He said he has been running this comparison informally for the better part of 40 years. He switches between homemade and commercial gear, depending on conditions, and the pattern holds up every time. In dry conditions, the gap closes a little. In cold, wet, or muddy conditions, the simpler mechanism wins consistently. He said his grandfather used a version of this design in the 1930s, built entirely from scrap metal off an old harrow frame, and the principle was already old when his grandfather learned it. That is the part that stuck with me. This is not an invention, it is a rediscovery. The same logic that drives it has been used by trappers across North America for well over a century. Fewer parts means fewer failure points. Fewer failure points means more consistent performance in the field. That is not an opinion. That is basic mechanical reality. So why does the trapping industry sell you an $80 trap with 7 moving parts when a $3 version with 1 moving assembly outperforms it in real conditions? The answer is not complicated. A $3 trap built from hardware store components is not a product anyone can brand, patent, package, or put on a store shelf with a margin. There is no licensing deal. There is no influencer content. There is no collector's edition. There is no reason to manufacture it at scale because you do not need to buy it at scale. You buy the parts once, build it in 10 minutes, and you have a trap that lasts as long as the metal holds, which is basically forever if you oil it seasonally. The commercial trapping supply industry in the United States generates over $200 million in annual revenue. That number depends entirely on people continuing to believe they need purpose-built equipment that only specialty retailers carry. The moment a significant number of trappers start building their own gear from hardware store parts, that revenue model starts to crack. So, the industry does what every industry does when faced with simple alternatives. It ignores them. It does not debunk them. It does not argue against them. It simply does not acknowledge they exist, and it keeps the conversation focused on premium features, updated designs, and incremental improvements that justify the price. Earl told me he stopped recommending homemade builds to newer trappers about 20 years ago because they did not believe him. He would explain the design, they would nod politely, and then they would go buy the commercial version anyway because it looked more legitimate. Because it came in a box. Because a sponsored trapper on television used it. He said watching that happen enough times wears you down until you stop offering the information to people who have already decided what they want to believe. He only showed me because I asked him directly and told him up front that I had no products to sell and no sponsors to protect. He said that was the first time in a long time anyone had come to him that way. There are a few refinements Earl has developed over 60 years that are worth knowing because they make a noticeable difference in the field. For mink specifically, he reduces the spring tension slightly by stretching the spring about a 1/4 inch before attaching it to the bracket. Mink are light-footed and quick. A heavy strike telegraphs too much vibration before the mechanism fires, and some animals pull back just fast enough to avoid a clean catch. The lighter tension fires faster at initial contact and compensates for that reaction speed. Earl said he figured this out after watching mink behavior over multiple seasons and noticing the pattern in how misses happened. For muskrat in muddy bank sets, he coats the entire bracket with a thin layer of rendered lard before placement. Not to add scent, but to create a barrier between the metal and the wet soil. Soil packed into the notch area is the most common cause of slow strikes in wet conditions. The lard prevents compaction without affecting the mechanical function. He reapplies it every 3rd set. Cost per application is essentially 0. For sets near running water, he stakes the trap chain at a 45-degree angle downstream rather than straight back from the set. Animals moving along a water edge typically orient their escape direction downstream when startled. A chain running against that natural escape direction creates resistance that works against a clean hold. Angled downstream, the chain loads with the animal's movement instead of against it. Earl said his grandfather taught him that specific detail, and he has never seen anyone else mention it in any commercial trapping guide he has read. That last point matters more than it might seem. These are not tricks someone invented to sell a course. They are observations built up across multiple generations of actual field experience, passed down because they worked, preserved because the people who held them believed the knowledge was worth keeping alive. Earl's grandfather trapped during the Depression when a good fur haul was the difference between a family eating and not eating. There was no room for methods that sounded impressive but did not perform. Everything that survived from that period survived because it actually worked. The comparison table we put together from our 72-hour test is straightforward. The homemade $3 trap, 4 triggers, 4 clean catches, 0 jams, 0 misfires, functioned at 28 degrees without any loss of mechanism speed. The commercial $80 trap, 3 triggers, 2 clean catches, 1 misfire due to soil intrusion in the spring housing, slight mechanism, hesitation observed in the early morning cold footage. Total cost difference over a full trapping season, assuming 10 resets per trap. The homemade version cost you $3 once. The commercial version cost you $80 once, plus the catches you lose to the 1 in 3 misfire rate that showed up in our test. Earl walked me back to his truck when we were done, and he pulled out a notebook. It was water-stained, and the cover was held on with a rubber band. Inside were decades of trap set records. Dates, locations, animals caught, weather conditions, gear used. He had been keeping that notebook since 1978. He flipped to a page near the middle and showed me a comparison he had run himself in the winter of 1991. Different terrain, different target species, but the same basic result. The homemade design outperformed the commercial trap by a similar margin in cold and wet conditions. He closed the notebook and put it back in the glove box and said, quote 4. There is something else Earl told me on the drive back to his property that I keep coming back to. He said, the hardest part of getting newer trappers to use simpler gear is not convincing them it works. The hard part is convincing them it is allowed. He said somewhere along the way, people started believing that if a piece of equipment is not sold in a specialty store, it must be against the rules, or not legitimate, or somehow cheating. As if effectiveness is only valid when it comes with a price tag and a brand name attached. He traced that attitude back to the 1980s, when commercial trapping supply catalogs started getting thick enough to be mistaken for phone books. Before that, most of the trappers he knew either built their gear or modified what they bought to suit the conditions they were working in. Building was normal, modifying was expected. The idea that you needed to use a product exactly as manufactured, without alteration, as if it were some kind of certified medical device, that was new. That came with the catalogs. And then it got reinforced by trapping shows on cable television where sponsored trappers used sponsor-approved gear and never once showed you a coffee can full of hardware store components. Earl said he watched the knowledge shift in real time over the course of about 15 years. The older generation kept doing what worked. The newer generation kept buying what was marketed. And when the older trappers retired or passed on, the knowledge went with them in most cases because nobody had bothered to write it down or film it or pass it along to someone who would preserve it. That is the part that bothers me the most about all of this. It is not that the industry makes money selling expensive gear. Industries make money. That is not a scandal. What bothers me is that in the process of building that market, a generation of practical knowledge got quietly buried, not because it stopped working, but because there was no commercial incentive for anyone to keep it visible. Knowledge that belonged to everyone, that had been tested in real conditions across real seasons by real people with real stakes in the outcome, just faded out because it was not profitable for anyone to keep teaching it. Earl still has it. A few trappers his age still have pieces of it. But the window is narrowing. Earl is 86 years old. The notebook in his glove box is not going to teach itself to anyone. And if the people who hold this kind of knowledge stop being asked for it, eventually they stop offering it. Not out of stubbornness, but out of exhaustion. Earl told me he had not talked this much about trapping methods in years. He said it felt strange, like dusting off something he had almost convinced himself nobody wanted anymore. That is the only reason I drove 3 hours on a Tuesday in October, and the only reason this video exists. That notebook represents something the trapping supply industry cannot manufacture, cannot improve on, and cannot package for retail. It is 60 years of honest observation by a man who had no reason to lie to himself, because the only person his results affected was him. When Earl's traps caught animals, his family ate, and his bills got paid. When they did not, the reason went into the notebook. No sponsors, no quarterly earnings, no social media engagement numbers. Just what worked and what did not, recorded in pencil on water-stained pages in a truck glove box in rural Pennsylvania. The next time you are standing in front of a wall of commercial trapping gear, trying to decide whether the $80 model justifies the price over the $45 model, remember what Earl showed me. The question is not which commercial product is better. The question is whether you need a commercial product at all. $3, a bracket, a wire, and a spring. 8 minutes to build, 60 years of field validation. That is what the industry is hoping you never find out. Go to your hardware store this week, find the fasteners aisle. Pick up a flat mending plate, a small tension spring, and a length of galvanized wire. Build what Earl showed me. Set it next to whatever commercial trap you currently own on the same game trail and let the camera run for 3 days. Then come back here and tell me what you found. Drop your result in the comments below. I read everyone and I will reply. And if you are not subscribed yet, do it now and turn on the bell, because every week we bring out exactly this kind of knowledge. The stuff that works. The stuff that the industry would rather stay buried. The stuff that belongs to anyone willing to learn it.